Hi, everyone. Welcome to Doing Sociology. Today, we have with us Professor Aparna Rayaprol, who is the former head of the Department of Sociology at University of Hyderabad, where she also is presently teaching. Her areas of interest include gender studies, Indian diaspora, qualitative research methods, and urban sociology. Earlier, she was an associate professor in research methodology at the Tata Institute for Social Sciences in Mumbai. She was a faculty on the semester at sea fall 2003 voyage, which went around the world. This included 10 countries, teaching courses in sociology. Her PhD was from the University of Pittsburgh. Her research on second generation Indian Americans was funded initially by an ICSSR grant on Indian diaspora and Princeton University at the Center for the Study of American Religion in 1998-99. She continues to work in the area of diaspora and gender, as well as globalization and gender in the Indian context. She's the author of Negotiating Identities, Women in the Indian Diaspora, which was published by the Oxford University Press in 1997. She was the director of the Study in India program from 2009 to 14 at the University of Hyderabad and was associated with it since its inception in 1998 and has been closely involved with its academic as well as administrative responsibilities. She has been conceptualizing and teaching new courses for SIP and coordinating the academic activities between teachers and students as well as reciprocal institutions. A very warm welcome to you, ma'am. Very happy to have you with us today.
Thank you, Dipali. It's wonderful to be here. And I really think that sociology is not just about thinking and writing, but it's about doing. So I'm so happy to see this series that you all have conceptualized, and it's been going well. Happy to be here.
Thank you so much. To sort of begin our conversation today, you talk about immigration and as an epistemological crisis in your book, which is Negotiating Identities, Women in the Indian Diaspora. Could you please talk a little bit about the nature of this crisis?
See, one of the very interesting aspects about mobility and movement is moving usually from a situation to a situation. And migration, or especially immigration, when you're talking about moving across borders, moving across the country or the nation's boundaries, is something related to either an emotional home or a geographical home or a political home or all of the above, in that sense. But there is a link between what we call the homeland and the hostland. And sometimes that crisis comes by not being able to articulate what is it that one is going to lose and what is it that one is going in search of. And of course, a lot depends on the context of migration, the context of what one is leaving behind. So in many ways, we call it the voluntary migration and the forced migration. So when I studied my first group, that is the immigrant group, the migration that went from India to the United States, and I studied specifically Pittsburgh, this was a group that was mostly middle class, educated, and were going to find a better living, to move up the social ladder, and probably to make a future for themselves. And leaving in 1960s, many of them, an India that did not offer all those opportunities, but they were going elsewhere. So there was a voluntary migration. In one sense, they might say it was forced, they didn't have enough jobs, but then definitely it's not indentured labor. When we're talking about forced migration, we're talking about someone who is uprooting people and making them work elsewhere. So in our case, historically, if you look at it, it's the British, so they go as a sojourner population, sojourner and not a settler. So while one end of the continuum was the forced migration and the voluntary migration, there is the temporary migration of the sojourner and the more sense of permanency, which is the settler. What does settling mean? Settling actually means maybe, putting your flagpole in there, buying property, finding a job, having a child. Various kinds of things happen for a person to settle. So, in that sense, the crisis that I'm talking about is often exacerbated by circumstances which are extremely, in the traditional sociological sense, the demographic sense, there was a push factor and a pull factor. A push factor from the host land, usually we term it as economic, it could be familial, it could be something of that kind. A pull factor, and when we talk about a pull factor, the pull factor could be opportunities, running away from unhappiness that has resulted for various things. So much of literature has been written about the migrant, about the imaginary homeland. Salman Rushdie's talked about it in very interesting ways. So the epistemological crisis that I talk about is really emanating from the fact that the immigrant woman is still feeling about herself as primarily an Indian, not necessarily an American in the context that I was talking about, even though she may have taken citizenship. What is she at heart? What does leaving your host country really mean? At home, things are different. People don't do that at home. So what is that home that you're talking about? The children will get absolutely irritated after a point to keep hearing about this parental home. Because for them, home is where they were born, where they are raised, and they're absolutely comfortable in this. But the epistemological crisis of not knowing where you are, where you belong, is something that's there. That is when people are feeling good about things and not really worried about their status. But in the case of a forced migration, starting off, of course, with slavery, circumstances were very, very different. And people were made to do what their bosses, owners were making them do. And forced migration is not just about slavery or indentured labor, but it could also be, what Saskia Sassen has talked about as, especially when it comes to women, the nannies, maids, and sex workers kind of syndrome. When you're going from one scenario to the other, even if you're going as a nanny or a maid or a house help, people are, conceptualizing you as a sex worker, even if one is not a sex worker. Somebody says, oh, you've gone out for what? Leaving your family, leaving your little children? And what are you doing there? Is it a decent living? Do you have the face to come back home? These are even though that may be a sojourner, that may be someone who's there for a very short period of time, having left her family with her parents, because the man left the home and she's a single mother and she needs to fend for everyone. The money that she's making being a mom to somebody else in Canada is something which is very, very different. So in her mind, this kind of the movement is always related to a confusion about belongingness. So when I'm talking about the epistemological crisis, I'm really referring to this sense of belongingness. What do you hold on to? When you say, I want to go back home, what is it? Are you talking about the physical space? Are you talking of the emotional space? Are you just talking of a comfort zone? What is it that you have in mind when you talk about that home? So for you and me, it may be different if we are in the nation of birth and the nation of sojourn is not there. But when someone is leaving a space, especially which has national boundaries, it becomes rather complicated.
Right. And this crisis that you talk about, does this vary based on social identity?
Absolutely. So I hinted gender, and in this context, I'll start off with the whole idea that women are not independent. This is what is prescribed. So whose wife are you? Whose daughter are you as a migrant? Somebody is asking you on the passport. At least today they write parents' name. Otherwise, it was only father's name at a particular point of time, or husband's name. So what does this naming to the passport really mean? The woman is always treated as a dependent migrant. In sociological literature, what we have is a very, very clear and common sensical understanding of looking at the migrant as inherently male, and that he has gone and he will take his family when he's ready to take them. And that has happened. I'm not trying to undermine history or say that it is a false construction, but to only construct the woman as a dependent migrant completely negates the kind of example that I just gave you. Even if she's going as a maid or as a nurse from India to the Gulf, if she's doing that, what is she going as? She is going as a primary migrant on her own. But sociological studies have not always constructed her as that. So the woman worker, so we're talking of gender, we're talking of class, then you talk of caste, maybe. Is it Dalit women or poor women who need to go out to earn a living because their circumstances are so different? Is it different for them? Who are the nurses that are going from Kerala for domestic work to the Gulf? So studies that have been done also tell us that these are women who are struggling with particular kinds of backgrounds, and these backgrounds are, somewhat different from the others. What am I trying to say over here? I'm trying to say that caste, class, religion, region, gender, sexuality, all these definitely, impact the way, migration happens, and the way this kind of a crisis is actually happening. This is one of the things that when we talk about, how does social location really impact this crisis. And for the, those who are more privileged, the crisis is less. And for those who are less privileged, the hurdles are more, the challenges are more, and the kinds of challenges that one faces are also pretty different. What am I talking about when I say that the challenges may be different? There are two things that I would like to put up over here, and that is, supposing somebody is going to study, in the United States or in the United Kingdom, going to do a PhD in one of the universities, which is very well known, and who is offered a job immediately after that. Okay, let us take a real example of Chandra Talpade Mohanty. She calls herself a feminist of color, South Asian origin. And when she's talking about third world women in the politics of gender, she says that, of course, as a privileged person, she managed to study in the best institutions in the world, teach at Oberlin College, one of the most, elite institutions there, and then ended up, I think, at Syracuse or someplace. But Mohanty is saying two things over there. One is that this, background of being a South Asian feminist scholar is making her, have alliances with women of color, Black women, women, or of from other third world countries, so from Latin America, from the Caribbean, so there is a kind of consciousness raising that has happened because the standpoint has not always been white. Therefore, definitely people who come from different backgrounds have different kinds of alliances that they forge, and their own experiences when they move outside will have, that impacting them. Looks like Rituparna has joined.
Yes,
Yes, yes. Hi, I'm so sorry. Actually, I got caught up in the mad Delhi traffic.
So, yeah, all going fine so far?
And what about religion? Does religion have any role in in immigration? And do you think there are interconnections between gender, religion, and migration?
My whole work is talking about these interconnections in ways that are quite beautifully, wrapped up into each other. One of the very, very, interesting kind of changes that have happened over the last several years is, what do you mean by religion? So, what do you mean by religion? How do you actually engage with very different kinds of, what should I say, identity formations in different contexts? And I can say that when I started my research about 30 years ago, to be precise, or it is something in the US that I was saying. I was looking at South Indian Hindu immigrant women who really were not very conscious of their religion. Religion was part of life, and, many of them were from progressive Hindu families where they didn't have to worry so much about belongingness because they were always part of the majority. But one thing strikes me: when they go into the US, they were so involved in activities of temple building or South Asian Islamic community activity, whether they were Hindus or Muslims, it didn't seem to matter. But they were involved in the process of religion, particularly if they were mothers. Because the burden, and I'm using the word burden over here, of cultural reproduction or religious socialization was squarely on the shoulders of the women. And when I did this ethnography at the Venkateshwara Temple in Pittsburgh, it was fascinating to see that these people were, surgeons by day, what should I say, professors, and by night they were trying to teach, Sanskrit or Telugu or Tamil, or, trying to get these kids to, understand religion. So then I was like, why are you really worried? She said, I'm not very religious, actually. I'm not into puja, as one of my respondents. But, if I bring Rahul 100 times to the temple, at least one time something might go into it. I said, why is it so important? So he says, she said, because, his friends go to the synagogue on Thursdays. Saturdays. And Sunday mornings, most of the children go to church. So the Venkateshwara rituals in Tirupati, the Pittsburgh temple was funded by the huge Tirupati temple originally, and today it's one of the richest temples outside India, the Venkateshwara temple. So she says the rituals of Saturday in Tirupati come on Sunday morning so that all the kids feel they're doing religious activity. So on the one hand, there is the acculturation, the assimilation into a new culture, but in America, this plurality included being different at that particular point of time. And very interestingly, in the 90s, when I was doing this, they did not mix religion and politics as much as it's mixed today. There it was much more about identity, about giving their children this. And then the older immigrants, who had children who were already in their 30s and 40s, they were worried about who they might marry, whatever. Later, 10 years down the line, people began to send their children to summer camps where they would be learning, slokas and the very interesting things that probably the older ones didn't do. So it was now gender. They wanted, I particularly took the example of a boy to tell you that it's not just, girls, but then yes, girls did have a greater burden. They had to learn their kuchipudi or their Bharatanatyam, classical Indian dance. And there was a set of twins actually whose Arangetram or, the graduation of the dance that I went to as part of my ethnography. And these were extremely confident young American women. And one of them said, "Oh, I'm so grateful to my guru. I'm so grateful to my parents and for all the time that I spend at Kalakshetra in Chennai. And I'm going to go every year and all that." So everyone was fascinated. They danced beautifully. The twin came and said, "I'm not going to do any of the things my sister said. I wish her good luck. And this is my last performance. I've done this for my parents." People were shocked, but that's the diaspora for you, So probably it was twin girls, both had to do what they had to do. The parents gave her enough freedom to give it up, probably, or she would just give it up at that point. But the other one would continue. And for them, so it's a very fascinating kind of privilege that they had. So when you say gender, religion, so how much had this learning of dance have to do with religion is something probably I didn't explicitly say, but it did have it because it happened in the temple premises. See, the temple was not just a religious center, but it was a surrogate extended family, as I called it, because they were missing that extended family and community back home, back to the homeland thing that I was referring to earlier. And that crisis, which they may have felt, epistemological crisis, became something, different, security, emotional security, and provided that space to continue the cultural reproduction, which happened. And women were the ones who were the harbingers of change, because they said, "Oh, my mom would never have done this, but I am doing this differently." So they did take things to the next level, but they also tried to instill a lot of that. Of course, the men were involved as well. So this is one thing, but I do want to bring a completely different kind of example into this when we're talking about gender and religion, by bringing in our more recent study, which my student Anushama Mukherjee and I did with reverse or return migration in Barkas in the old city in Hyderabad. And here, what I'm talking about is the Hadrami migrants in Hyderabad, and they are constantly talking about, living in the Gulf in the 21st century, bringing things back to Hyderabad. And, when you bring in religion, the religious identity in the Gulf is much, much more present than it is in Hyderabad. So to send up, when they went to the Gulf, they were poor. When they came back far richer. So it's a very interesting, the sojourner class that I was talking about. But when they came back far richer, they also want to instill some Islamic education for their children. And this becomes very, very interesting. And it has all kinds of complicated assumptions about, how social remittances, we use Peggy Lewitt's term, social remittances, in order to explain whether it is religion or food. There is this question of circular migration that we are actually bringing in. And of course, again, women take it upon themselves, and in this case, far more openly and, willing to say that, yes, we need to bring this change to our children. We need to make them more conscious, because, our parents didn't have the time to teach us some of this Islamic education. So I think our kids need that. And that is something that they learned out there as migrants and brought it back to Hyderabad. That was one of the things.
Related question. So we all use the phrase imagined community. It has become big. But how is this process happening, in the context of Indian immigration?
Well, I think all of us used it. I also used it. I agree that the whole idea of the imagined community is very, very important. But for me, I see that the community is experiencing it has a transformative streak in it conceptually, generationally. For me, I cannot see migration as a gender neutral process. I see it as a gendered process, but I also cannot see it as a fixed entity. So it is something which is constantly changing with generation. So what happens is, we have the migrant who becomes, as I was saying earlier, the sojourner trying to be the settler. So when they settle down, what do we mean by settle down? They immigrate. They take on the citizenship of the new land. And when they do that kind of settling down, they begin to look for, a homeland, which is their own homeland if they are the migrants, but it is the homeland of their parents if they are second generation. So this imagined community is something which is directly related to a very important concept called nostalgia. Frederick Jameson talks about nostalgia for the present. And there he kind of talks about migrants looking at the home country and trying to imbibe what is happening there now. See, today things are a bit different, because with social media, it just happens that you are sitting, all three of us are sitting in this same time zone in the same country. But we could very well be doing this interview with anyone else for whom it's morning, right? Or afternoon. So because of this platform, you haven't come to Hyderabad to do this, and I haven't gone to Delhi to do it either. So there is this whole thing about, when you're away, how do you imagine a community? So for our children today, it's very easy. They'll switch on and say, Acha, yeah, I can see it. My friend has gone out there, to see the Eiffel Tower, and she's texting me from there, and we are video chatting, and I can see something behind her. But in those days, there was no Zoom, or there was no online chatting. So you had to think of something. So what is it that's most important? Memory making. Memory making is the most important part of an imagined community. Who makes memories? When Urvashi Putalia was writing The Other Side of Silence, she was dealing with painful memories of people. They wanted to, they didn't want to remember probably the sexual violence that was related with partition. However, they did. But memory making sometimes can be as painful and violent as that, or it can be absolutely wonderful, or it can be an inane memory. Oh, I'm making this tomato chutney, but it doesn't have the same taste because the tomatoes that you get in India, especially in a certain month, are absolutely different. I don't know which India they're talking about. The tomatoes that you and I get now may also be just like the ones they're getting somewhere or not. I have no idea. It is a very, very important kind of nostalgia. And this, what is that community that you want? What do you aspire for? A community that is pleasant, that is nice, that is home. So today you say you don't want your grandmother's recipe because somebody else's grandmother's recipe is online. So is that the community we are looking for? Some people, yes, probably that's fine. That's okay. But the imagined communities that we're talking about in diaspora studies are usually very, very keenly connected to passages, people's journeys, people moving, the earliest passages and the most unhappy ones are related to the Holocaust, of course. And that is where the word diaspora actually came from, the Jewish connection. So there it was directly linked to the idea of exile. So there was a homeland that one would go back to all the time, especially in the mind. So when the Jews got together in a different country, they had a very different kind of image. It's known that a lot in many places, Jews do not buy German products even to this day. Whether it's a car or a grinder in the kitchen, it's still a kind of traumatic entity. So what is a community and what does that community actually exclude? That is one of the things we need to talk about. And for the Indian diaspora, I think it's very, very important to have that sense of, the beautiful India that one has created, that imagined India without its rupture, without its disjuncture. But migration is a process of both rupture as well as disjuncture. That is something that we need to remember always.
So, what impact does reverse migration have on the cultural practices of the homeland, particularly in relation to religion and gender?
Reverse migration?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Return, reverse. These are very, reverse is when you go somewhere and then you come back to where you left, if not to the place that you left, at least the place that you did. Again, my own research, my PhD research was talking in the 90s to people who left India and went outside. Then when I went back for my postdoctoral work to Princeton, and I did a little bit of that in California as well, I was talking to the second generation, people who were born in the US and they were there. And, more recently, we were looking at people who returned to India. So one of the very, very interesting aspects about it's reverse migration, but we don't know whether they have returned because they have kept something back in their other homeland. So we are moving away from the concept of a single homeland to the concept of multiple homelands. We're talking about spaces that are very, very interestingly, diverse. And why are they coming back? So if the India that some people left in the 60s and the 70s did not have so many opportunities, post-liberalization and in the 21st century, especially after the IT revolution, everything began to open here. And people found opportunities and people began to start returning. So this whole idea of reverse migration is also linked in many ways to what the state wants you to do. And the state definitely wants people to come back, and they want them to come back and settle in India. What do we mean by settle? They want them to contribute to the finances. So, in fact, the NRI, NRO, all these were categories that the state had created. The PIO was a category of person of Indian origin. Now, when you brought the point of religion in, when somebody said, I left generations ago, but I would like to come and have a pilgrimage to India, or I would like to come back and contribute to building temples in India. So you see a lot of Swaminarayan temples across the globe being sponsored and built by diasporic Indians. So you also have more, clear contributions to making a particular kind of identity. Or you have sometimes, in the 80s, you had the idea of Khalistan being talked about much more in the diaspora, in the Punjabi diaspora, than in Punjab itself. So because this was being sponsored. So when you're talking about rivers and religion, so this is one thing that I can say, that you see more assets, because people who come back, they come back with wealth that needs to be reinvested. And once it's reinvested and they're secure economically, they can, that's true of either direction of migration, they can spend for religious activities. So whether there are temples dotting the diaspora, or you have new and more interesting mosques in Hyderabad that are inspired by the Gulf, it is that kind of contribution wherein we definitely saw people belonging to a particular religion coming and staking their own hold. Gated communities, for instance. There are several gated communities where construction is happening for very, very elite and rich, and they also like to say you will have all the facilities. So along with the swimming pool and a badminton court and a cafe and everything, medical shop or whatever they want within the premises, they also put in a temple. Almost homogenizing again that kind of a community. So it's a very interesting kind of consolidation of one's religious identity without taking into consideration what is the religious tapestry of the group. What don't we have people belonging to different groups here? Does everyone want to have a temple in this premises? But sometimes the return migration also happens because one has lived the minority status in the country that they had migrated to, and although they have come back to a country where their religious identity is probably the majority, they still want to assert it and may also aspire for a certain political kind of affiliation.
Right. So, you also address the question of gender in relation to migration. Most of your works are on that. So if you could talk about this relationship with a few examples, for our listeners.
Definitely, I can do it. The first aspect of, migration and gender is when, let's say we're talking about a woman who migrates just because she wants to have a better living for her family, because of financial reasons. So when she migrates, her migration is, say, rural to urban. I'll stay with that for some time, and within India. When we're talking about rural to urban migration, we are talking about opportunities. Now, if you look at women who have migrated as part of their families, what we call marriage migration. In India, a lot of people marry because they are, expected to, not because they want to. It's a what we call a life cycle ritual. You are whatever 16, 17 years old, and your parents start looking for a groom, and they want you out as a young girl. And this man has decided to migrate to the big city. So that big city has opportunities, and she has no skills. She's a school dropout, no skills. So she starts going to construction work along with her husband. And when she does that, what happens is she is continuously expecting that it will be simple. Now, a lot of times the man takes to the bottle and does not contribute to the household. Slowly, she has children and she becomes the primary breadwinner. So construction labor is not taking her anywhere, but so she moves into domestic labor. Domestic labor becomes something little more skilled. To bring in my return migration angle here, the employers may be people who have come back from New Zealand or Australia or wherever, and they want her to become a dog walker because they don't have the time. They want her to take care of the children. So she's multitasking, right? So in one sense, she's picking up skills, and slowly she learns how to make international cuisine. She knows how to boil pastas and grate cheese and, do a whole lot of things which probably she would not have done in that context. So when she does that, what is her aspiration? The aspiration for any woman who's working and making a living is that her children should not have the same situation as hers. So what is that? Upward social mobility and education. Migration, to explain this better, has facilitated that mobility. And we all know that. I'm not telling you a new story. But the interesting stories around us are that migration and mobility are very, very gendered. What is different is she goes and she puts her children into schools. And these children are not going to be having to do daily wage labor or domestic work. They will be put into school, they'll study, they'll aspire, and it creates a whole new society wherein we are dealing with very, very young, bright, first generation learners. So there is that dream of the woman. Very often she has managed to put in her efforts, her labor, and do it. This is within the Indian context. The not so happy stories are the women who I alluded to, the Saskend studies and others, where women go out for domestic work and they go as sojourners, but they bring in a lot more money in a shorter period. But unfortunately for them, that short period is the time of their children's childhood, and there is a distance that comes between the mother and the child. What about the single migrants? Migrants who are single have, if they move to locations that are more liberal and allow them to live their lives peacefully, it's okay. But if they move to expat societies where they are almost without, or any freedom because the passport is with the employer. And once the passport is with the employer, the women can barely, go out on their own. So I think it's quite a challenging and difficult situation, and the issues of the female migrant and her struggle become much more difficult when there are cases of violation of human rights, of sexual violence in a strange land where the employer might be a potential sexual harasser or someone who has assaulted her, and she has no access whatsoever to the legal systems. There are many NGOs that have come up in different diasporic contexts just to help immigrant women, because they are the ones who have been struggling without a way to make a living. And what sometimes it also happens because of what used to be called green card divorces. Very often a man comes to India, marries a woman, takes her, and this need not be a poor woman but an educated woman, as a dependent. But he's actually got married only because his parents put pressure on him, and he did not actually tell them that, okay, I was already involved with someone else in the country that I came from. So he goes back to her and abandons this woman, and she does not know what to do with herself, and she has no legal basis to do it. So does the state come in? At that time, the Ministry of Overseas Indian Affairs was set up to handle some of these for some time. But then again, it got, merged into the External Affairs, Ministry of External Affairs. So how do we as a state handle women migrants who need to be either brought back home? I don't like to use the word rehabilitation. That's the word the state often uses, or at least support there. So because the state support is not good enough, NGOs and women's organizations would actually come out, because the typical battered women organization, say in Germany or something, does not have the language to deal with the South Asian migrant. So you need someone who can speak the language of the woman who's in distress, who can handhold her and give her local support and support to be able to make her own living, which means she needs a different legal status. And sometimes she just does not want to come back to where she went from, her natal home. So it becomes much more complicated, I think, in this context.
Right. So finally, our question to you is on research methods and how methods like ethnography and interview play. What role do they play actually in highlighting these processes that you've just talked about?
Yeah, I think one of the very interesting aspects of what should I say, leaving stories behind, as I see it. How do we actually get the migrant stories? And you wanted to discuss both ethnography as well as interviews, and I think it's the most beautiful kind of narrative that you can get. Oral histories, interviews these days, focus group discussions. But I must tell you a little story about interviewing, and that also will be generational. I can't seem to get out of that. But when you talk about the first generation, talking about identity, this reticent, not clear, not okay, India's my home and I'm here also, and family, and that kind of hesitation I could hear. When I did the interviews with the second generation, people who were born there, bang on, I had to put on the tape recorder and that's it. just talk about it like you opened a tap and you have that hole. And it was just at this time. Today, of course, you think everyone wears their identity on their sleeve. But in the 90s, it was a very interesting kind, late 90s, this was a very interesting kind of thing. Was I'm an Indian American. So I'm an American. Yes, I happen to be of Indian origin. So that's the way they would see it. And so there was no hesitation. So with this whole acronym of ABCD, American Born Confused Desi, did not exist. Sorry. The confusion is those of us who are labeling them that. They are very, very clear about who they are. It's like when they come to India, say, oh, you look Indian, but why do you speak with an accent? Everyone speaks with an accent. Whether it's an Indian accent or an Indian accent, we have what, 40 dialects and, so many different kinds of things. So how do we actually do that? So I'm saying that today, the migrant stories, and with all your different technology that's available, they are wonderful and people are doing great interviews. So how do you do these interviews? Which community do you want to interview? Where you find them? That's a whole different story. Some of the earliest feminist work was about, actually sharing their own pain. Women who would have these experiences would go and say, I am so and so, and I would like to, I myself was abused, and I would like to talk about stories of migrants who have been abused. And they would start off from the experiential in many ways. So this experiential reality is something that we, talk about. And I think the narratives have been so good and so deep. And in Barkas, my student Anushama had a wonderful time. Every time she comes to Hyderabad, she says, ma'am, I have to go to Barkas for a wedding. I have to do this, because she was living in their homes. She was this Bengali Hindu woman who was not very welcome in some of these, very, very traditional Muslim homes. But then she went and she built her rapport and started visiting them, had to spend nights sometimes with the families. And it was quite a great experience for her in that sense. So I think whether we are in a city or like, Hyderabad that I was talking about, or anywhere else, the interviews are the ones which will allow you to get a sense of a person's journey. What happened before? What happened after? How do you compare your lives with your mother's? How do you start? Sometimes people are not happy to start talking about themselves. So I would, kind of do ice breaking by saying, compare your lives with that of your mother's. And that was absolutely like, opening. People would just talk about it so freely. And now, focus group discussions, especially for people who have a common, painful memory. You don't want to discuss something, but there are others who want to discuss that kind of a moment where you could never go back when your parent died, So you will find a lot, like especially now with COVID times, there's so many people who could not come to say their last goodbyes. So if you want to talk about something like that, and the whole sense of loss and not having a closure, I think we need to explain to ourselves that, at least I have a preference to doing ethnography, going into the, field. And now the field could be anywhere, right? So it's so wonderful to be able to listen to these stories, and you do realize that people want to talk, but everyone can't do interviews in a way that makes people talk also. That's what I tell my students all the time when I teach methodology classes, because you can't be half interested in listening to someone's stories. Those who want a lot of data, it's out there online. That's also possible. So, but we need to be good listeners, to be interested, to want to ask more. Then you go back, read that interview the same night, and if possible, go back to your respondent. And that's another thing. Keep that door open to be able to return to them. And because first time everything does not click. You don't ask, you're overwhelmed by someone's life story. You're shocked at the amount of, you thought you had a hard life, and you listen to somebody else and think, oh my, this is a picnic, why, what am I complaining about? So these are the kinds of revelations that happen in life. And I think doing sociology is not just about, throwing concepts at our students in the classroom, but about connecting to people. And when we connect to people, because what are we doing ultimately? We are talking about us, we are talking about ourselves, we're talking about, what we learn and what we need to unlearn. And when we do that, I think we have to be the better listeners, because we claim we are sociologists. And I think for that, we have a little more responsibility in, recreating these stories, I think.
Right. Thank you so much, Professor Rayaprol, for shedding light on so many things. And I'm sure that for anybody who's looking to work on gender, migration, and the diaspora, this would be very useful. I also hope that they go back and read your works, as well as, how to do research on these areas, because you have also extensively spoken about that. So on behalf of Doing Sociology, let me thank you for giving us this time and opportunity.
You're very welcome, and don't hesitate to come back if there are any gaps. And, it was indeed a pleasure. And, there's so much to be done. So, yes, I think diaspora, migration, and gender is something where I see a lot of work has been done, but a lot of interesting stories to tell in different parts of the world. And I wish both of you a lot of luck in what you're doing as well.
Thank you so much. And that's very kind of you. Yeah, thank you.